Ashurbanipal was cruel as the Egyptians would not have wanted to have the Assyrians come and attack their city. Another example of Ashurbanipal being cruel is in Source 6, where the carving shows people being flayed and having their tongues removed. The inscription for the source explains that Ashurbanipal lived into the city. Like the onset of a terrible hurricane, I overwhelmed Elam in its entirety. I cut the head of Tuman, their king, the haughty one, who plotted evil. Countless of his warriors I slew. Alive, with my hands, I seized his fighters. With their corpses I filled the plain out about Susa with the Baltu and Ashagi. Their blood I let run down the Ulai, its water I dyed red like wool. This once again shows Ashurbanipal being very cruel to others. Source 8 shows a relief of Ashurbanipal on a lion hunt. This would have been hung up in the royal palace for visitors to see. Although this is different to the other reliefs, it shows him being cruel to animals. You can see him stabbing a lion in the right hand image, and in the left you can see a number of other animals that have been killed also. This just shows another way that Ashurbanipal is a very cruel person. This goes to show that Ashurbanipal's cruelty was necessary for the stability of the empire.
You're gonna pop two.
Back to Shiloh.
Alright. You suck, by the way.
Thank you.
I will. Not everyone thinks that Ashurbanipal was very cruel though. In Source 2 it talks about Assyrian kings had advisors from all over the Middle East. The source talks about how people from Egypt and other places would work for Assyria and how the government was not just a copy of Babylon. This source is reliable as it comes from Karen Radner, who is a university professor, so she knows what she is talking about. This is backed up by Source 3, where it explains that Sargon understood that to control a large empire, he had to persuade people that they should come to his side without fighting a battle. Source 7 describes Assyria as not an unusually brutal civilization, but that Ashurbanipal was particularly brutal. Normally women were not depicted being hurt in Assyrian art, but Ashurbanipal has art that includes attacks against women, including a pregnant woman being ripped open. Source 7 also says that Ashurbanipal was very interested in religion, making two of his brothers priests and restoring many temples. This means that some sources show Ashurbanipal as being very cruel, while some others do not show him as so cruel. More modern sources seem to have different perspectives on Ashurbanipal compared to how he presented himself in the stone reliefs. As before, this showed that Ashurbanipal's cruelty was necessary for the stability of the empire. I don't know anyone else. There's a whole
Who are we popping two guys at the end?
He's like, Aiden Suffer, top Aiden.
Thank you.
Why do you think you want to follow? You're just going to go back and forth?
This report has looked at a number of sources to talk about the cruelty of Ashurbanipal and how it affected the Assyrian Empire. A lot of sources show that the Assyrians torturing and attacking other people, but some of the more modern sources show that the Assyrians' kings could be more level-headed than the ancient inscriptions did. Altogether, this shows that Ashurbanipal's cruelty was necessary for the stability of the empire. 736 words.
Okay. So guys, what's our gut feeling on that one? Would you say that's a good response, an average response, a bad response?
Felt very average. Average is bad. Yeah.
I think
Do not lie. I was highlighting the things I didn't lie.
I would say that is a bad. I would say that one will struggle to pass. Can anyone point out from the things they got from it what was bad about that response? Nate?
They started talking about how the source was reliable, and then that it comes from Karen Radner, who is a university professor.
their response to the question? How well did they respond to the question, do you think?
They
So it's the same one you're away. The question was, what was the actual wording of it? Ashurbanipal's cruelty was necessary for the stability of the empire.
Yeah.
So, did they actually talk about the stability of the empire at all? They talked a lot about his cruelty, but they didn't relate it back to the question or to the statement. Even now, was the question, was Ashurbanipal cruel?
No.
No. It was brought up in the question that he was cruel. So there's nothing wrong with looking at how cruel was he, but it's not necessarily what the point is supposed to be. So that's another trap that a lot of students fall into, is they latch onto part of a question and they just go full force on that part, but they haven't really answered the question as a whole. Yeah, a couple of times in that one I think it says, this shows that Ashurbanipal's cruelty was necessary, but they haven't actually showed how his cruelty was necessary or how it changed anything. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
In terms of their source of information, how was it?
Very good. They quoted and said, yeah, it's accurate.
I would say their source evaluation I classified as they tried. Like, it is in there.
Right.
I don't think it's amazing, but they made statements that you, like, and we're going to have a go at marking this in a bit. There's statements in there that you can look at and be like, oh, that's evidence for this. But they didn't do a great job.
Brand points.
Did they do comparing perspectives of sources?
No.
I think there's like a line where they say most of the ancient sources show this, the modern sources show that.
They
There's
talk
like a line, and they do talk
Yeah.
about.
In-
I keep saying they. I wrote this, but
That's awesome.
and I can tell you, I found it really difficult to write this. You wouldn't believe how much harder it is to write one that's deliberately bad than it is to write one that's alright. Yeah, so there's not a lot. Okay, let's flip over the page, guys. This one is a respectable 918 words, so it's within the word limit. Sorry? 800 to 1,000. Okay, sorry?
I can start reading, so.
I don't want to do this whole like tennis match between you two again.
Fine, I'll pick someone else.
Aiden, you choose who to start with.
Tennis match would be really fun. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was one of the first world empires, holding onto power partially by ruling through terror and violence. This report will discuss the extent to which King Ashurbanipal hurt by halted the stability of the empire through his use of brutality. First, how brutal Ashurbanipal was will be discussed, and then how this brutality hurt and helped the stability of the empire will be examined. Hop to 8.
Ashurbanipal ruled at the peak of Assyrian territorial gain, shortly before the empire fell. This gives ample room to compare his brutality to that of other Assyrian kings. He left more than a little evidence of his brutality, with over 35% of the Assyrian reliefs showing brutality being attributed to him. Source 7, in brackets. In these reliefs, he often speaks in first person as if he personally committed each act. For example, in Source 1, he describes the torture of the city of Syria, including skinning and beheadings. Source 6 includes a description where he killed so many that the nearby river had its water dyed red like wool from all the blood. As these reliefs would have been created on his order, and there are many of them, they can be seen as a reliable measure of how he wanted people to perceive him, as a man who would do horrible things to people who crossed him. This is not unusual from the Assyrian kings. Most kings had similar reliefs and inscriptions, with Ashurbanipal and 3 others, including scenes of violence against civilians. Source 7. Ashurbanipal unique only in that his reliefs showed violence against women, which was uncommon in Assyrian reliefs. As this information is presented by a historian of Assyria, it can be seen as a reliable characterization of how Ashurbanipal compared to other kings. As well as scenes of torture, Ashurbanipal also was depicted as a protector of the people, taking part in lion hunts. That showed him less as a brutal dictator and more of a benevolent ruler with the best interests of people in mind. This is once again an ancient source created by the king at the king's request. At the king's request, so it can be seen as a reliable measure of how he wanted to be seen. The idea that Ashurbanipal had a less brutal side is supported by source 2, where Karen Bradner, the history professor, describes how the Assyrian government took advice from all sorts of experts and advisors on how to act. Dozens of specialists are observed to have advised Ashurbanipal on how to act, giving strong evidence that he acted with consideration and his real acts were for a purpose. Taking these points together, it can be seen that Ashurbanipal was very brutal, but perhaps only a bit more than average Assyrian king, with his brutality serving God.
If Ashurbanipal was brutal, it can be seen as it was part of a larger plan, keeping the Assyrian Empire stable. The peak of the Assyrian Empire can be seen in Source 4, covering thousands of square kilometers, spreading as far as Egypt in the south, Urartu in the north, and the Persian Gulf in the east. This high watermark of the empire was achieved during Ashurbanipal's reign over the empire, and it appears the policy of brutality was designed to keep a hold on the territory that had been gained. If a city knew how horrible it might be if they rebelled, it is likely that they would not be as eager to resist Assyrian domination. This paints Source 1 and 6 as less as bragging about what Ashurbanipal did to all those rebellions, and more as a warning to those considering following a similar path. Sarah Melville talks about Sargon II in Source 3, stating that in order to understand him, we need to understand the challenges they faced and figure out why they responded as they did. While Melville is referring to a different king, it is just as applicable to Ashurbanipal. As a challenge faced by the Assyrian, as a challenge faced by Assyria have been the huge size of the empire, it is likely that their response would have been to prevent rebellions by any means necessary, including brutality. By combining these sources, it can be seen that the brutality of Ashurbanipal was a purposeful attempt to help the stability of the empire. Top to Charlie.
So given the aim of Ashurbanipal's brutality was to keep cities from rebelling and maintain stability, it remains to be seen if this strategy worked. There is strong evidence that it did not, at least in the long term. Source 1, 5, and 6 all detail rebellions from areas all over the empire. While the purpose in creating these sources was to show the king is powerful, it has the side effect of also showing how many rebellions he was dealing with. While no mention is made in these sources of why the cities rebelled, it stands to reason that Assyrian brutality may be a contributing factor to why so many cities were trying to leave the empire. Source 7 explains that the Assyrians had the worldview that rebels were going against the divine will of the Assyrian god Ashur. This would likely have caused even more motivation for cities to rebel, supported by the amount of reliefs showing the rebellious cities. By taking the evidence together, it seems that Ashurbanipal's brutality might have kept rebellious populations down briefly, but the policy of being brutal to citizens actually caused long-term issues for the stability of the empire.
Okay, what do we think about that one, guys, in terms of its compared to the other one?
Far better.
Far better?
The second sentence was really hard to read.
I didn't edit it, so that was it happens. Okay.
There's not many,
So what was that one better? Before I say anything, what did you guys pick up that was better about that one? Like, in what ways was it better? Remembering that these are things that you want to be including into your own thinking when you're making yours. Nate?
When they reference the sources and use like words in it, most of the time I don't actually see the entire one.
Yeah, it was a lot more of this person, i.e. me, thinking. I wasn't just saying this is what the source is. That was something that was a big issue in the previous one, is most of what they said was just describing directly what was in the sources. They weren't then relating that to anything. So they're saying, this source shows this. This source is kind of similar and it shows that, and so on and so forth. Noah?
They don't focus on one particular thing, they do about a bunch of different things about the kings.
Yep. And the particular things that they focus on, do they link to the question? So they They look at the elements of the question and then bring them all together to answer the question. Shiley?
The high vocabulary, historical terminology, and they answered both sides of the question. Or
They answered both sides,
answered the whole
but
question.
did it have a clear hypothesis?
Yes.
What was the hypothesis?
That his brutality was not essential to the empire.
The one thing I would say on that is perhaps that could have been clearer at the beginning, like that hypothesis was made very clear in the conclusion, but it wasn't necessarily clear what I was going for the whole way through. It wasn't until the end that I brought all the evidence together. You don't necessarily have to have it at the beginning, but I think it does help to, so that way as you're reading through, you know exactly what you're looking for. Nate?
When you went to talk about reliability of source 2, you didn't just say that it was she's history. She knows what she's doing. History. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so it goes into a bit more detail. I'll be honest, in this, probably I would have liked to talk about the usefulness and reliability of sources a little bit more. I don't think it was as good as it could have been, but you know, it's not supposed to be a perfect example, it's supposed to be a good example. Anything else we noticed that was good about it, or anything that it improved on the previous one? I mean, obviously for one it's within the word count, which is good. The other one's a little bit below.
How Nate was saying with the sources, you didn't just quote them word for word, you said what the source was and explain how that worked.
Yeah. One thing I didn't do with those sources is explain like this is documentary evidence, or this is literary evidence, or this is that kind of thing, which you probably would like to do in your actual one. Okay. Now guys, what I want you to do is to start on that first example we looked at. So we looked at the less good example, and I've handed out everyone a ISMG sheet. So this is the same thing that I mark when I get to yours. What I want you to do is one criteria at a time. So I normally start with the top one, formulate. I have a quick skim through and I say to myself, okay, is there evidence in terms of that first dot point? Is it partial, fragmented, or mostly inaccurate use of term or terms? Is it appropriate use of terms? And is it thorough and mostly accurate use of historical terms? So go have a read through, see where you think that one sits, and then highlight that dot point. Go through for the next one. Just look at all three of them. So the top box, the middle box, the bottom box, and see which one it fits. I don't think any of them will be in the bottom box, does not. I hope not, at least. I didn't try and make it that bad. But most of them should be somewhere. My gut feeling is most of these dot points will be in the bottom, or the middle box or the lower box, would be my gut feeling. I don't think there will be much in the top box at all for that one.
To get to the very bottom box, you have to only put the misspelled name on there.
More or less. So what I want you guys to go through is and I'd like you to work in pairs or threes for that. Go through and say where you think it fits. So make sure as well, if you have a look up on the screen, guys, if you have a look up on the screen, I've got my ISMG here. So if I'm looking at this, what I want you to do is I don't want you to just go, oh, I think that's a 1 or a 2. I want you to actually go through and say, okay, I think it had maybe appropriate use of terms, but the explanation of issues relating to the question, that was rudimentary. It wasn't appropriate. And then the third one, understanding of the link between concepts in the question or reasonable understanding, that might be superficial as well. So based on those three, it's got 2 in the lower box and 1 in the box above, so that would be a 2. I'm not saying that's the correct mark, I'm making this up as an example. So I want you to actually go through and do the 2 examples. Instead of circling the box, you can also highlight the one that it fits. But that's the way I'd like you to have a go through and do it. So in your groups, guys, I'll give you 5 or 10 minutes to have a go at marking that task. Jordan, welcome. Here, grab one of these. I'll come and explain what it is in just a moment. I better mark the roll first, though. Jasmine, you may. The other thing, guys, that might help you, if you see evidence of something, so for example, you might say, okay, Karen Radner, who is I forgot to put my highlighter on. Karen Radner, who is a university professor, so she knows what she is talking about. You might say, okay, well that is partial or fragmented. So you link the evidence on the document with the
They can't get above that because they didn't have judgment. It just can't get above that. Or even like, did they use evidence from some sort of perspective?
Well, they said about perspective.
Yeah. So I guess like, I mean, it's not like they didn't satisfy any of the
See, this one also says perspective, and the top one says perspective. So, because I kind of see it as being
yeah, because usually say if you get all three at the top, it says six.
yeah.
But like, it's one of those things that says
it's sort of difficult for me to work my side where it's like this is really bad 25.
Yep. So that all of your assessments this year will be out of 25. And if you get 25 out of 25 with this exam, you already have 1/4 of your marks for the year done.
Yes.
Which means you're already halfway to a pass on your first assessment.
That's great. That's the goal.
Yeah.
I know this kind of like about the externals and a little bit more about this.
But the externals for
Make the empire stable.
Today's I think each one essay. I wouldn't say it was
it's more about I think it was
frequent or silent.
I would say somewhat maybe. And then we'll give that a year. And then we can kind of go back and do this.
Yeah.
Maybe say it does use some. There's the ones, yeah.
50% would be 12 and a half. 50% isn't necessarily a pass.
Can it be lower?
I think
I feel like the pass might be like a little bit.
what you've got to do is it's an absolute pain in the butt because I can't just be like, oh, a 12 is a pass. I have to actually look at your standard elaborations. So it says like, for an A student, this is what they do. For a B student, this is what they can do. For a C student, this is what they can do. So if you've got like 10, you might still be in that C category. And if you've got an 18 or like a 19, you might be in the B or you might be in the A. So I've got to then go and like look at that and then look at it against the standard elaboration. Like where do you know this?
I thought it was just like
There's
the
not
numbers
a
that definitely.
For you guys, numbers are definite because you don't get an A, B, or C. You just get a number.
I think it's a difference. Maybe it's that's generous.
I don't know how they only have 4 something on it.
Next Thursday.
So, sir, I hear that you're going to stop reading it once you get to the word
If it looks
limit.
a little bit.
I've been informed that's what I'm supposed to do.
So, do we go to?
Okay,
People
well,
play dumb. They're like, oh, I didn't even think to consider that.
Remember, one of your skills is choosing the most important information. Like, there were things in that good version where there were some things I wanted to keep on going talking about, but I'm like, oh, I'm coming close to word limit, I'm just going to stop.
See, that's easy.
what time is it when you were getting close to the word limit?
But you should know roughly where you're.
Let's get out of bed. Let's go straight down to
For the exam. Yeah. Probably, yeah, it'll be a mechanical. And the end of an era. Although you guys might be on there for your external. Because it'll just be you guys.
I remember my desk was really sticky.
Yeah, because they do graphs up there, so I imagine some kid was like gluing stuff and it's like.
And then my paper just kept getting
Yeah, I think that one's straddling the one between pass and fail. And I'd say it's leaning more towards the fail. Yeah, it's like some say, yes, you're on track.
oh my god. You just say no.
Like, so, like I said, you're working hard in class with your Okay, ladies and gents, I want to go through this. I want to go through this first one. So, I've seen some people are obviously still working through that, and I've seen some people have finished it. I think the lowest mark I've heard of so far is an 8, and the highest I've seen so far is a 10. Did anyone get outside of that range if you've gone through the whole thing? No? Okay, let's go through it together. So, let's look at the formulate criteria first. So, the first dot point, we have thorough and mostly accurate use of terms placed into historical contexts. Can you put your hand up if you thought that that student got thorough and mostly accurate use of terms placed into historical concepts? You probably could justify that one. Because all that is use of their language. And they didn't have... Their language, they didn't use too many things that were incorrect. There was like one, I think, example in there that I thought was, yeah, that's not correct. Well, I wrote it, so of course I thought that. But I would say you could argue that top one, or you could say appropriate use of terms placed into historical context. Partial, fragmented, or mostly inaccurate use of term or terms, that's mostly if you've just like, it's barely recognizable as what you're talking about. Like you're using, it's clear you don't know what you're talking about. That student knew what they were talking about, they just didn't know it to a high level. So they would be probably in that dot point there. For the next one, did they have detailed explanation of issues related to the unseen question? I would say absolutely not. It wasn't detailed at all. And they barely related it to the unseen question. Did they have adequate explanation of issues related to the unseen question? That's another one where you might, if you sat there and really read between the lines, you might be able to argue, well, it was adequate. But I think realistically, it was rudimentary explanation. So it was a very basic explanation. So that one would be down there. And the last one, an informed understanding of the relationship between concepts and a variety of ideas developed in response to the unseen question. The unseen question was talking about the relationship between the Assyrian cruelty, or Ashurbanipal's cruelty, and the stability of the empire. Did that first example, did it talk about the relationship between those two ideas? Not at all. So you definitely can't say informed understanding. You can't say reasonable understanding either, because they didn't engage with that idea. So you would say, at best, a superficial understanding of the link. Now, because if you see here, they have 2 dot points in this box, that means their mark has to come from that box, because it's where the majority of their information is. Because their third dot point is in the box above it, that means they get the upper mark. If the third dot point, if they didn't have anything for it, or if it was below it, they'd get the lower mark in that box. So for this student, they got 2 for formulate. Now, just in terms of you guys and your planning of assessments, formulate are the... I can tell how I'm going to mark you essentially by your formulate mark. Because if you haven't... And this is why that 15 minutes of planning is really important. Because if you've identified 2 or 3 decent arguments that support your hypothesis, straight away, you're probably getting 5 or 6. If in your planning stage you've got those 2 or 3 good arguments, and you've made it clear in your introduction, almost straight away I can give you in that top box. And those are easy marks. Those are easy marks. I think tomorrow and maybe even Monday, because I know we've got a lot of people away tomorrow, we're probably going to do that practicing of the planning out your essay a little bit more, because I don't think that was something, well, when I observed you guys do it the other day, it was something that I saw a lot of people just like not making any notes. Even me, someone who knows this stuff really well, and I planned all the sources, when I went to write these, I had like half a page of notes. So I knew what I was talking about. Okay, let's have a look at analyzing. So, did this student have discerning identification of the features of evidence from a range of sources in the stimulus supplied? They did talk about the features of evidence. They talked about what the sources showed. Did they necessarily talk about the most... discerning means they're able to pick out the most important bits. Did they necessarily talk about the most important bits? No. I think actually... I described every single source in that example except for the map. That was the only source that I didn't describe in that example. So they didn't get discerning, but did they identify features of evidence from the sources in the stimulus? Yeah. So they would get it in this box for that top dot point. Let's look at the second dot point. Detailed examination of features of evidence. So this is the difference between identification of features. That's basically saying this is what the source shows directly. The examination of features of the evidence is where you're going a bit deeper in your thinking. So you're saying this is what this means, or this implies this, that kind of thing. So did they have examination of the features of evidence, a detailed examination? No. Did they have an examination of the features? I'd probably need to have another read through. I don't think they did. Did anyone see any evidence of examination of features of evidence? I don't think so. So we might say rudimentary examination of a feature of evidence of a source or sources. And the last one, informed explanation about how evidence from sources combine stimulus supplied contributes to the development of the hypothesis. Once again, they didn't really have much of a hypothesis, did they? So they've really shot themselves in the foot because so many criteria come from how well you've argued your hypothesis. So I don't think you can give them the top box. The second box, explanation about how evidence in the sources in the stimulus contributes to the development of the hypothesis or the unseen question. What this person did at the end of each of their paragraphs, they've said, therefore Ashurbanipal's cruelty was necessary. But they haven't actually linked that to any evidence. They've just made a statement about it. So you could say superficial, because they haven't made any explicit links. So that student would be getting a 1 in that criteria. Next criteria, synthesizing. So synthesizing is all about how you bring evidence together from different sources. Now they did actually do this a little bit, so I wouldn't expect to be seeing necessarily a 1 in this one, because they did link sources together with similar ideas. So, did they have a combination of information from the stimulus to justify insightful decisions? I don't think there was a single insightful decision in that. Did they have a combination from the stimulus supplied to justify reasonable decisions? Now I'm going to disagree with those head shakes because they use evidence from this. They use stimulus items to talk about Ashurbanipal's cruelty, which is relevant. The only issue is that is a single decision, and it does say decisions. Combination of information from the stimulus supplied to justify reasonable decisions. So, there is, however, this line in the conclusion. The more modern sources showed the Assyrian kings to be more level-headed than the ancient inscriptions did. So that is evidence of a decision. They've looked at the modern sources and they've said, well, they have a different perspective, so you can actually use that as evidence. So they've made decisions about the cruelty, they've made decisions about the modern versus the ancient sources. So I actually can give them this middle dot point here. Oh, sorry, that was the top one. Sorry, I went double middle instead of top middle. Okay, next one. Combination from information in the stimulus to support his sophisticated historical argument. No. Combinations of information from the stimulus to support a basic historical argument. Once again, they have made a basic argument. Ashurbanipal was cruel. So you can give them evidence. You can give them credit for that.
What's the difference between basic and superficial?
Superficial is just on the surface only.
But then wouldn't you also say that basic is also surface level?
Superficial to me is they've basically made statements that haven't been connected or corroborated with evidence.
Yeah.
Whereas a basic means there's evidence to support it, it's just not the best argument.
Yeah.
So for that one, I would say that their argument was basic. Had a pH level of 10, am I right? Is that right? Is 10 basic? Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, third dot point, guys. These combinations use evidence from a range of sources in the stimulus supplied. They used almost every stimulus piece in their argument, so the easiest mark in the entire assignment. But still, that's only a 2 out of 4. So this is another one where I think your synthesis, as long as you're getting evidence from a bunch of places, this is marks that are freely available. This person did a really dodgy assignment or exam, and they still managed to get 2 out of 4.
Why are we still pretending it ain't you?
Because it's weird to say I all the time.
Just
Whereas
don't
this
take
is a-
credit for bad work.
And like, just FYI, I based a lot of the decisions made in that assignment on assessment I got last year in Ancient. So while
There was 8 of us.
while I wrote this, it is very much based on student work.
Not to name names, but there was 8 of us.
Okay, evaluating, guys. So this is where we're talking about our usefulness and reliability of sources. Were there discerning judgments? So discerning means they've picked out the best ones about usefulness and or reliability. Did they pick out the best judgments about usefulness, reliability? No. Did they have adequate judgments about usefulness and or reliability?
Did they talk about usefulness and reliability?
Or did they make... They did talk about reliability. I don't think they mentioned usefulness specifically. I would agree that what they did would be classified more as statements than judgments. Like, they did make a judgment, Karen Radner is reliable because she's a university professor, but their justification for that is she probably knows what she's talking about. So I would give them partial or fragmented statements about usefulness and or reliability. These judgments use evidence from a range of sources and or refer to different perspectives in the stimulus supplied. These judgments use evidence from sources and refer to perspectives in the stimulus supplied. These statements use evidence from a source and refer to a perspective in the stimulus supplied. Now, I think I might surprise a couple of you guys here. They actually got up here. These judgments use evidence from sources and refer to perspectives in the stimulus supplied. Once again, it comes back to that one sentence I highlighted over on the left. They compared the perspectives of the ancient sources compared to the modern sources. So they have compared two different perspectives. They've hit the criteria for that one. And now the third one, the judgments are well reasoned and corroborated. I don't think so. They haven't really explained why their sources, they haven't backed up with what they're saying with evidence. These judgments are appropriate and corroborated. Or these statements are inconsistent, superficial, or vague. I'd probably put them down in the superficial or vague one. So what would that give them overall for that criteria, guys? 2. Last one, creating and communicating. Now this one is the easiest marks ever. I've had students before get like, 1s and 2s across the other criteria and get like 4 or 5 in this one. So as long as you're coherent and clear in what you're doing, even if everything else you say is rubbish, you can still get good marks here. So, was there succinct with ideas related to the unseen question and hypothesis conveyed logically? Did it convey ideas related to the unseen question and or hypothesis? Or did it convey ideas that are frequently unrelated to the unseen question and or hypothesis? All of the ideas it brings up do have to do with the question and the hypothesis. I don't know that I'd say they're succinct and it's conveyed logically though. So I'd probably give this one in the middle. There were ideas related to the unseen question and the hypothesis. Next one, features of an essay in response to historical sources and ethical scholarship are consistently demonstrated. Did they reference their sources?
Yeah.
Was there an introduction, body, and conclusion? Congratulations, top box. And was there minimal errors in spelling, grammar, and punctuation, or some errors in spelling, grammar, and punctuation? Some. So, 3 marks there. So we go up, that's 3, 5, 7, 8, 10. So this student, this hypothetical, what are you doing? 10 out of 25. So guys, that one is on the borderline. A 10, I was saying to the people at the front before, when I give you a grade, I can't just say a 10 is a pass. I'm not allowed to. I have to actually look at your exit standards, and there's basically these statements say a C student does this, a B student does this, an A student does this, and a D student does this. So I'd have to go to that document and highlight the things that you have done and see where this student would sit on that before I can say that's a C or a D. But based on that response, I would say that's a borderline C minus D plus response. Depending on how you justify it, you could argue that was C minus, but I'd feel dirty doing it. Okay.
Because it was your work.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I wrote that when I started out, like, oh, I'll try and make a C-ish response. But then, like, as I went through, I'm like, oh, this is worse than I intended it to be. So it ended up being lower than I intended it to be. Which, you know, probably sums up a lot of you guys' work as well. Okay. Guys, what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to give you... Oh, no, we won't. Thanks, guys. That took a little bit longer than I thought it would. I was going to go through the next one as well, but I don't know that we'll have time to go through that whole one together. Did anyone get to the second one yet and give it a mark?
Yeah. I started.
Well, what I'm going to do, guys, is I'm going to come around and hand out your scene sources for the exam. So what I might do while I do that, can you please read through that second one again and give it a really quick mark out of 25? So just go through. I don't need you to go back and get specific evidence, but give it your gut feeling where you think it sits. And I'll come around and hand out your scene sources. Actually, no, I'm going to wait till we go through that because otherwise you get distracted. It's going to shock you. This map made it in.
Oh my god. I have never once used that map in any of my things, and I don't think I will.
That one, that second example does use it, and they use it well. They, I do. You know. Humble brag.
You'll split Pascal.
Huh?
You'll split Pascal.
It's a very mean-spirited show.
It is. I do not like it. I do it to myself.